this session today, as you know, if you've seen my earlier lectures, you'd know that I've been covering poets from America, and today for discussion I have picked up the poetry of E. Cummings. Now we have covered a lot of these poets who have written in English. This series is basically has been on poetry that is written in English. We have tried not to cover the translations here. But what we have done is to look at poets who have written, who have been a part of the American milieu and the English milieu, and those who wrote in English. So, as part of the American poetry series within this larger unit that we are covering, I have done a series of poets with you covering from the 19th century to the 20th century. Today, E. Cummings in many ways, is a poet who again falls within, both the traditional and the modern. In fact, he's literally at the, he's born in 1894. So, just he carries the old tradition of say American Puritanism, etc., but very soon discards it. So, you see, you find that a lot of American and we have discussed, in our previous discussions, we've had these lectures on modernism as well, and how modernism as a movement in a way swept a lot of this English writing. Now, in this case, when we look at American modernism, then we must remember that American modernism is slightly different than its English counterpart, where you have writers who who have a sense of grounded earthiness, if I may say so, where they are not entirely bereft of hope and are not despairing like their English counterpart. And you will find something similar in Cummings as well. Even though we often see him as a modernist poet, we see him as an avant-garde poet, we notice that the kind of helplessness, despair, or a sense of nothingness that you notice in modernism of the English kind of the English poets, that is not so much apparent in American poets. The American poets seem to still find faith in human effort and human potential, and that is what sets them apart. In many ways, that is, I think, a better version of modernism, because here, even you see, when we look at the modernist poetry, think of your T.S. Eliot and the Tribe, you will notice that there is a sense of a sense of waste, which is obviously determined by the kind of life that these poets lived, and also because these poets lived through the two very horrors of the two world wars, and therefore you find that modernism has, in a sense, a sense of a void, and believes that essence is hardly to be found in life, because there are so many ruptures and there are so many tragedies that that in a way grip life. But something like that is not so much visible in the American modernism, because even though you have modernist writers there, and T.S. Eliot is also, you'll see him also as Anglo-American in many ways, but what you find is that the American poets really have also, that also has to do because they joined the World War very late, and in the Second World War also, so they have been tried to keep themselves out of war. So perhaps that could be one of the reasons why you find American modernism to be different from the English modernism, because English modernism talks about tragedy, horror, despair, helplessness, a sense of nothingness, and there is no faith in the future. But American modernism really finds faith in human capabilities. Now, for E. Cummings also, this is true in the sense that he, like any other modernist poet, he rejects, there is a sense of repulsion for the traditional structures, whether they be literary, social, or others. So there is a sense of rejection of the old, and at the same time, E. Cummings does not see this kind of industrialization and progress that marks America at the turn of the century. He doesn't see this as very hopeful. So there is a sense of anathema attached to this kind of life for him. In fact, he calls this life of progress almost like a grave. He says, the humanity is building its own grave. So there is no faith in the industrialized future. There is a clear rejection of the past. But in E. Cummings, there is a sense of faith in the present and faith in human capabilities and human bonds. and that is something that sets him apart from other modernist writers of his age. Now, just to give you a sense of the man and the poet also, if you look at your screens, you will see that he was born in Cambridge, and his actual name is Edward Estlin Cummings. The dates, as you can see, they are from 1894, so just at the turn of the century, when America is becoming capitalistic and materialistic and progress is unfolding at an unprecedented scale, and you see this kind of America going through a complete change towards materialism, machinery, etc. Now, E. Cummings wanted to, as I told you, that he rejects the past or rejects social structures and also literary structures. He often, he used to write his names in all in lower case. So, if you see the screen, you will see that there is E. Cummings all in lower case. So, that is how mostly he wrote his name. In fact, he also referred to I in the small case, the small lowercase I. So, so you can already see how he is very versatile in terms of his use of language. Now, as he is a poet, he is also a playwright. He's written a novel, and he was also a painter. So, a man of many hats really. He also worked for an, during the First World War, he enrolled himself in the army to be, as part of the ambulance tribe, and he was an ambulance driver. So, he joined the war for a bit. So, he was in that sense adventurous, but also trying different literary modes of expression. Now, he became one of the most innovative writers therefore during this period, 1940s and 1920s onwards. In fact, he was looked at a writer of liberation, whether it was social, sensual or literary. He was known with the sense of a person who looked for liberation in his poetic style, and that became his distinct poetic style. What also became his distinct poetic style was that he actually played a lot with language. He used to turn phrases. He's very experimental in his approach to poetry, because he would write verses in a very different format. In fact, he's probably one of those poets using the visual format in poetry. He would skip grammar, not use syntax, etc. So, you can understand that how the poet is changing. In fact, for some writers, some critics believe he's too simplistic, and is it the case that he's using he's at fault when he's using this kind of simplistic language or breaking syntax and not using verbs in just doing away with verbs altogether, in fact treating very innocuous words as nouns. So, there is a discussion around him where people feel that he's not really one of those great serious writers. But one must remember that Cummings does what he did very deliberately. It's not like he's come from a very humble background or has not received the kind of education you expect somebody. If you read his poems, you might think that this doesn't appear to be a very learned man. On the contrary, Cummings' father was a university professor in Harvard, and he pursued both his MA and BA from Harvard University. He in fact also attended the Cambridge Latin High School, where he studied both Latin and Greek. So, we are looking at a writer who's well read, who's pursued both his bachelor's and master's, who's had a family of professors. Like his father was a professor of sociology, and he was a great writer and excellent speaker as well. His mother also kept diary entries and was an amateur poet and would read out the verses to the kids. So, Cummings' fascination with language in many ways at one level came from his Harvard upbringing. He likes to call it downbringing. He says Howard put in all the structures on him, which he then finally rebelled against. So, it's an interesting take on upbringing. He says, no, I wasn't, it's not upbringing, it was a downbringing, because I was caged in structures that I wanted to break. So, what I mean to say is that he was fascinated with language and what it could do, and he often felt like peeling the layers of language and creating a new language that could that could immediately transfer the experience that the poet was experiencing to the reader. So I think the wordplay that you find in Cummings has a lot to do with his parents also, because that's the environment he grew up in, and also because of the Harvard sort of culture that he was a part of. He had friends who were professors' kids. So it's that kind of hold on language that he has, where he feels very comfortable and in a position to actually do away with grammatical rules. So very interestingly, very conveniently, Cummings would just tweak some linguistic rules, do away with grammar, and create fresh symbols and dynamic poetic expressions in his works. So Cummings' father was very much interested in social life, and he wanted to do social good. On the contrary, when Cummings grew up, he joined the aesthetes in the college, and he wanted to bring out a monthly, Harvard Monthly for instance, and he devoted himself to unraveling the process of writing and the aesthetic principles that governed it. So he is a person who, within the modernist tradition, obviously he emphasizes the individual, and for Cummings, in fact, poetry was a practice or an expression of the individual primarily. And he said that criticism in fact kills or is far away from poetry. What the only the only way through which you can understand poetry, according to Cummings, was through the language of love. And this is Rilke's expression that he used, and he said this is complete in itself, that it is only through love that you can connect with a poem and not through criticism. So he was against the kind of strict rules that were applied in writing, whether they were grammatical, syntactical, thematic. He wanted to bring out a kind of fresh code in poetry, and which is why you find that his poetry often uses these different kind of compounds, and in fact it's very visually done. Sometimes he just turn the words away and make them into visual pictures. So this is the kind of work that this poet did, and which is why he's often known as the artist poet in many ways. He was an artist who was also bringing his painting, so to speak, on his poetry. So you could look at his poems and they were visual poems. So which makes this critic Norman Friedman, who's also the biographer and who's also written a lot on Cummings, in his work E. Cummings, The Art of His Poetry, Friedman noted that certain very distinct characteristics about the style of writing in Cummings' works, his art of poetry. Imagine he's, the fact that this critic feels that his poetry is about art. So art and poetry go hand in hand when it comes to Cummings. And I will just quote from this book so that so that you get a sense of Cummings' works also. Now, Friedman here says in his book that, and I quote, "To look in his works for the signs of a tragic vision, for an ambivalence of structure, for a studied use of verbal ambiguity, for the display of a metaphysical wit, for the employment of mythic fragments, for the climax of a spiritual conversion, this is to look for things which are simply not there." Unquote. So what is the idea that Friedman here is projecting? That he is not a poet of some serious somber world. He is not a poet of tragic visions, or he is not going into some philosophical ambivalences of life, talking about the bigger things, as you would think poets of projecting somber reality. He's not even a poet who is talking about some metaphysical scenario. In fact, and it's not like a spiritual climactic sort of writing. He says these are things that don't exist in his work. And at the same time, let me take you further to another quote from the same book. He says, and I quote, "To complain that he lacks maturity of vision, variety of forms, intelligibility of diction, true seriousness, a sense of artistic purpose and development is to misconstrue the nature both of critical principles and of Cummings' poetry." unquote. So you see, he's often been critiqued on these grounds that, you know, this is a poet who doesn't really have a maturity of vision, and, you know, his diction is not so good. He's not a serious poet. You know, you can delight in his works, but he's not a poet who can make to the canon, which is also why you find that, you know, even though T.S. Eliot and E. Cummings were contemporaries, you would find T.S. Eliot in every syllabus. You would find T.S. Eliot as the god of modern poetry, but you would rarely find E. Cummings finding his way in this. And this is when E. Cummings was actually one of the most popular poets in America after Robert Frost. Like in the 1940s and 50s, a lot of people were quoting from his poetry because he dealt with subjects that were about human life, and they were not about some intellectual strains or some philosophical matter. So, you know, this is one important trait you would find in E. Cummings. So, Friedman further, you know, goes on to explain to us what is to be found in his works, right, and you know, how to go about it. So, basically what I am trying to suggest here is that he is not a poet of some symbolic tensions, and he is not somebody who is talking about some grave situations or somber things in life. He in fact delights in the simple pleasures of life, but at the same time keeping the artistic truth intact, you know, and recreating the best that exists in human life and human effort, you know, bonds of love, bonds of friendship, connection with nature. There is a sense of romanticism again then attached to E. Cummings, again something you will not find in a lot of modernist works. Modernism, I mean, you could say that it is to some extent there in Yeats, but after Yeats, you know, Yeats is often seen as the last romantic because he carried some romantic strains within his modernist you know, practice. But beyond that, you don't see that in a lot of modernist poet. You see something like that in E. Cummings. He is able to retain the childhood or you could say the innocence of childhood experiences intact in his poetry, and which is why his poems are direct. Of course, they play with words, and you know, you can't, sometimes you can't make sense of them also, but the idea is very simply that he is trying to capture the essence of primeval emotions, but at the same time humanly felt effort or human potential. So, you have Friedman tell us, and let me quote another one from you, from the same book for you, and he says here that the speaker of Cummings' poems then is always a poet and a painter, and this has been a matter of endurance, almost ritualistic in its disciplined and consistently sustained self-abnegation. The man has in effect died that the artist might live. Now, what is the meaning of this particular quote? It suggests that once you have Cummings come into the spirit of the poem, once there is a subject which is there in the poem, then the artist takes over. The man recedes. The man in fact dies as the artist lives through the work and creates this beautiful expression. In fact, Cummings had problem with everything that was within quotes made, so he said that anything that is already made is not for me. He is a poet who likes to make things, create things. He is a poet in making, but also a poet who likes to make things in the process. If I don't know if it makes sense to you, but what is made means what already exists, what is already canonized, what is already seen as rules. So he wants to break all those structures and rebuild something from experience, and that brings in novelty and also a kind of spontaneity in his works, and which is why he gels very well with the romantic poets. Now he's therefore looking to create art and as an artist, so he's not happy to copy, he's not happy to have ready modes of writing. He wants to be the artist who's going to create something new. Now Friedman also says that the artist who swallows the man becomes in turn a man again, only this time a man who has been purged, cleansed and purified, suggesting that once you have thrown the pre-existing person with pre-existing values, set ideas about literature, life, society, relationships. Once you've thrown that person out, the artist comes in as a kind of a tabula rasa, and it comes in with just creativity and creates a man after his heart, according to him. And this time this person is cleansed and purified and purged of all the previous structures that existed, and it is here that the person becomes a true poet, according to Friedman. This is what was the case for Cummings, and this man who can see then with clear eyes, because now you're not wearing the glasses of society, how society wants you to look at things, but you have your own clear eyes, you have your unconditioned emotions, and therefore you love without fear men who are whole, entire and alive. Now this is what is the essence of Cummings' works. I hope this has been able to give you a sense of what how Cummings has been perceived and what kind of a poet he is. Now, as I said, I will quote from one of the poems here, so just you have an idea of what is it that he tries to prioritize. He says, and Cummings really was not the kind of person who would give titles to his works. In fact, he would not even use the uppercase for his spellings. He would in fact twist spellings, he would change spellings, you could see them as errors, but they are all these kind of innovations that he is bringing to his works. So in his poem, since feeling is first, he says, and I quote this particular phrase from the stanza, since feeling is first, who pays any attention to the syntax of things, unquote. So you can already see that he doesn't want to pay attention to the syntax of things, precisely because he feels that it compromises feeling. And here you can already see the romantic strain there, because even for romantic poets of the 19th century, feeling was above any kind of rule of grammar, or was above any kind of structure, or was even above rationality. So here too Cummings emphasizes the idea that since feeling is first, who pays any attention to the syntax of things, which means what is syntax? The word arrangement, the way things are arranged. He says in arrangement you have killed the real spirit, and therefore in all his poems you will find there is a kind of experimental syntax. And which is what makes his poetry unique. Also avant-garde. Now why avant-garde? Because you see the kind of work that Cummings was doing, he was reinventing poetic language, he was trying to bring novelty to his verse, right? So he felt that structures inhibited meaning, and therefore he felt the urge to consciously play with them. Now this is about literary or linguistic structures, but this was also true about social structures, and he was somebody who was who would also use satire, sometimes biting satire in fact, to critique this kind of already set structures in society. So he is one of those poets who very early in his career moved in the direction towards breaking structures, in many ways an iconoclast who believed in liberating the spirit. Now this kind of movement actually comes to the fore in a big way in the 1960s. Think of your Allen Ginsberg and the Tribe, the beat poets, who are angry and are frustrated and want to break structures and are bohemian in their approach. Now in many ways E. Cummings dies by 1962. So just so therefore I call him avant-garde and also a precursor, because he is able to, a couple of years before, decades before the actual movement comes to the fore, he is able to give voice to this kind of protest, and he is one of those poets who is able to see where society is headed, the kind of crass commercialism and capitalizing the capitalism that has taken over American life. You see, we cannot forget the fact that capitalism as it grew in America was very differently felt as it was as against how it was felt in the rest of the world, which was still dealing with war, old traditional ties. America had there was a complete rupture by the end of the 19th century, where it had moved towards this kind of aggressive materialistic world. So it is against this background that Cummings is also projecting this kind of stifling of experience, and this is what makes Cummings' writing very interesting, also avant-garde, because he is able to say much before the beat poets what they would take forward. So with this, I have given you a poetic overview of Cummings' works. In the following lecture, we will take the specific poems and discuss them in relation to all the topics I have discussed in this lecture. I hope you found it useful. Thank you.